Yo, what's going on, guys? It is your boy Nick here, back again with a brand new video today. We're going to be continuing my series in which I review every single Marvel Cinematic Universe film up to release of Ant-Man the Wasp Quantumania. Today we're going to be reviewing Captain Marvel, which is the 9th film in Phase 3. So Captain Marvel was directed by Anna Boden and Ryan Fleck, and stars people that I'm about to go through. The film obviously stars Brie Larson as Carol Danvers or Captain Marvel. I do think that she is pretty good in the movie, despite a lot of popular opinion that Brie Larson wasn't that good. I actually liked Brie Larson quite a bit in this movie. I don't think it was necessarily the best acting I've ever seen, but I thought she was pretty good, and every scene she was in I thought she did a pretty good job in. There are some critiques you go about it that I'll probably talk about a little bit later in the video, but for the most part I thought Brie Larson did a pretty good job as Captain Marvel. And once again, Samuel L. Jackson is great as Nick Fury. I don't think there was ever any missteps with him and Nick Fury. I think his performance is honestly probably my favorite in the whole movie. I think Samuel L. Jackson is great, and I think that both him and Brie Larson make a great duo. They have great chemistry together, and they really do feel like friends with a very funny, kind of serious, interesting kind of little dynamic going on between there. And I think the two of them are really entertaining to watch. We also have another really good performance from Jude Law as Jan Rugg. Now, he's interesting because we don't actually see him too much with the scenes that we see him in. He actually does a pretty good job, and I don't know, because he's not one of the more memorable villains, but every time I watch Captain Marvel, I always really enjoy Jude Law in this film. Also, Lashana Lynch is pretty good as Maria Rambeau. Another one who, I guess, not one of the more memorable characters, but again, every time I watch it, I always think she does a good job. I think she and Brie Larson do a pretty good job as being friends. I don't think they're nearly as good as Brie Larson and Samuel L. Jackson, but I do think that Lashana Lynch and Brie Larson do actually work pretty well together on camera. Same with also the actress who plays Rambo's daughter, I think, also does a pretty good job of Brie Larson. This film has a lot of really fun banter. As I said, I really like the dynamic between the characters here, and I like the dynamic especially between Brie Larson and Samuel L. Jackson. I think that those two are probably the most entertaining to watch on camera. The banter between the two of them is a lot of fun. I think the film, for the most part, is a pretty entertaining story. It's an intriguing origin story that could have been executed a little bit better, but I still think that it was fun to watch, and every time I watch Captain Marvel, I always have fun with the superhero origin story there. This movie also has some pretty cool tie-ins to other Marvel movies, mainly Guardians of the Galaxy with Korath the Pursuer, as well as Ronan. Now, I do have some issues with that I'll touch on a little bit later, but I think it's cool to see this movie tie in with other Marvel movies. One of the high moments of this movie is the use of CGI. This film really does have excellent use of CGI. There wasn't really all too many moments where I thought the CGI looked not convincing. I thought the way the way the CGI looks very convincing. I think it's just very cool to look at, and this is probably like one of the most consistent CGI experiences of any of the Marvel movies that I've ever seen. And there are some kind of issues I'll touch on a little bit later that we'll touch on later. Also, the Skrulls. I forgot to mention the Skrulls. They're a really cool concept in this movie. And I think that maybe the execution with them could have been slightly better, but I thought that the Skrulls were cool. They're probably the most memorable part of the film and probably my favorite part. I thought the actors who played the Skrulls did a really good job. And I thought that the makeup and the actual look of them and the concept about them being like shapeshifters was pretty cool. So yeah, I think the Skrulls were really well done in this film. Speaking of amazing CGI, this film had amazing de-aging CGI, especially for Samuel L. Jackson as well as Clark Gregg. And like they really like made them look younger so convincingly that like I genuinely don't understand how they were able to get the CGI to look that good. And also, something I forgot to mention in my Ant-Man and the Wasp review, there was a scene where there was some de-aging that they did for Michael Douglas and Michelle Pfeiffer that was really amazing too, and that kind of CGI carried over into this film. I don't know how Marvel's de-aging CGI is so amazing, but it is. This movie also has some really cool 90s nostalgia, whether it's like the music or like the stores they were going to or the clothing, as well as some late 80s nostalgia because it's early 90s. I don't know, the nostalgic feeling of this film is really cool, and it makes it feel like it's set in its own era. And also we saw some origin stuff for Nick Fury that we didn't previously know. That was a lot of fun to see, and I thought that was a really cool aspect of the movie. Now, although I do like Captain Marvel, unfortunately there are a handful of flaws that I'm going to touch on right now. The non-linear structure of the origin story does make the film feel a bit messy and not cohesive enough. So, it's like I said, it's a good story. It's just that the way in which it's told in a non-linear structure makes it feel not as impactful as if it had been told in a linear fashion. I feel like had the story been told maybe in a more linear fashion, or had the non-linear fashion been structured a little bit differently, the story would have been a lot more compelling. And that's my big issue with the movie, is that it's a cool story, but just the way it's structured is not, it doesn't feel right. I feel like it could have been a lot more impactful had they structured it differently. And because of that, the origin story just doesn't feel as fun as I hoped it would be. It's still a cool origin story, it's just it could have been structured a lot better in my opinion. And then another issue I have is with the villain of Jan Rogg, played by Jude Law. And although I think Jude Law is a good performance, the fact that he's just a worker for Ronan kind of rings hollow for me, because Ronan was like the one weak part of Guardians of the Galaxy, which is a fantastic film. But the one weak part about it was Ronan as a villain. Like, the concept of Ronan was cool, but the execution just wasn't there. And so for Jan Rogg to be a worker for a not very well executed villain. It doesn't feel right. It rings hollow. I don't know. I feel like I'm probably over explaining it, but yeah, I don't think it was the right idea. I mean, it's a cool idea. I just feel like the execution just wasn't there. And as well as being a very kind of messy structure in terms of its nonlinear structure, the film also doesn't really have a unique directing style. Like if you watch Thor Ragnarok, for example, that film very much feels like a Taika Waititi film because it's directed in a way that has its own style. What's weird about this movie is that it's not really directed in its own style, so I wouldn't be able to tell that it was directed by a director. I mean, it's directed by two directors, so it's possible that maybe the two of them had conflicting visions or something. But it doesn't have its really own unique directing style, which is why underneath that note I have that the film doesn't feel cohesive, and it really doesn't. And I wrote, it feels a lot of very well directed scenes without a distinct style, and that's like kind of the things. That's not that this movie is poorly directed; it's directed fine, and like the scenes are directed pretty well. It's just the style is not cohesive. That's really the main issue. Is that it doesn't really feel like a very cohesively directed film. It feels like a huge amount of like very well directed vignettes, pretty much. And although I said that the CGI for this movie is fantastic, and it is, unfortunately the action sequences are kind of forgettable. They're just not very memorable because they don't have a lot to do with the story, and I think that's partially due to the story structure. Had the story been structured differently, and had the action sequences maybe been done a little bit differently, it probably would have been a lot more memorable. And unfortunately, even from a choreography standpoint, this film doesn't really have anything special in terms of its action sequences. I mean, whenever you watch them, they're fine to watch, but you don't really think about them all that much later, like you do with a lot of other Marvel movies. So unfortunately, those are the flaws I have with Captain Marvel. Real quick though, I'm going to talk about a spoiler scene, which isn't really the spoiler scene of the movie, but it's the mid-credit scene. I do like the mid-credit scene of this movie because if you guys remember Avengers Infinity War, we saw it in the end credit scene of that film. When Nick Fury was blipping, he had the little thing to call on Captain Marvel, and we see the origin of Captain Marvel in this movie, and now in the mid-credit scene for this movie, we see Captain Marvel meeting up with the Avengers for Avengers Endgame, which I think is a really cool scene. There's like more you could go on about that stuff. I just think as a whole, it's a cool scene to see, to go from Infinity War to what they did with Ant-Man and the Wasp and that stuff to Captain Marvel, and then seeing Captain Marvel go to Endgame. So even though like the quality is a bit inconsistent, the actual run of it in terms of its like story is pretty cool. And yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about the spoilers. Now, I have written in my overall summary of this film that Captain Marvel is a fun movie, but it's flawed, and I'm hoping that the sequel will be better because there's a lot of good stuff going on for this movie. It's just that the way it was structured is really the big problem with it. I didn't really have any huge like logical issues with it, and I also wrote down here that Brie Larson is not my issue with the movie at all. I thought she was really good, and I just think that had it been structured differently, the movie would have been a lot better because it had a lot of really good stuff, and there's a lot of things to like about the movie. It's just the execution is kind of what made it feel a little bit lackluster, but I still do really enjoy it, so I'm going to give Captain Marvel an overall rating of an 8 out of 10. It's an enjoyable movie. It just could have been slightly better, and I'm going to give it an overall grade of a B, and this is actually the same rating and grade that I gave to The Incredible Hulk, as well as Iron Man 2, and yeah, this movie kind of feels like it's in the same boat as those movies, because it's got a lot of good ideas, and it's a lot of fun to watch, but just its structure could have been a lot better. That's very much in the Iron Man 2 boat, and in terms of the Incredible Hulk boat, I talked about The Incredible Hulk is a good movie, but it's a little bit disappointing compared to the first Iron Man movie. And so, as a result, like, it's good, but it just doesn't feel like it was as good as maybe it could have been, and that's kind of how this movie feels. I feel like it's kind of like in between those two movies. Another thing I wrote down in my notes is that I think this movie's definitely overhated. It's certainly not as bad as people make it out to be. And I wrote that it was still awesome to have a strong female lead in an MCU movie, and that's stuff that I'm looking more forward to in the future. And I know that both Brie Larson and whatever her name is that plays Miss Marvel are going to star in The Marvels together, which I believe comes out later this year. And I guess that'll be the sequel to this, as well as the sequel to the Miss Marvel Disney Plus show. I'm hoping that'll be good. I didn't see the Miss Marvel show. I will end up watching it before the movie comes out, obviously, and I'll talk about that later. But I kind of just hope the sequel's better, because like this movie was good, but it could have been better. I'm hoping that the Marvels will be a lot better. I don't know, I'm just hoping for the best there. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Make sure that you hit the like button, hit the subscribe, hit the notification bell so you get notified about my latest videos. Leave a comment down below letting me know what you thought. And yeah, that's been it. Peace.